Thanks very much for inviting me and for the opportunity to engage in conversation. I really am honored to be part of this series, and a special appreciation goes to Professor Tate and, of course, the work behind the scene of you, Prof. Collins. Uh, So I'm hoping to leave enough time for us to have a conversation. And so I'll start off and then hopefully uh, taking about maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we can proceed. And I should say, uh, extend my regards to Giselle Thompson, who I notice is in the audience. uh, the title, as was said, is challenging the stereotype uh, and trying to change the statistics. That was a statement, the stereotype and the statistics, and came from one of the people who participated in the study that we did some many years ago, and that was 2004 that Tristana used it. And she talked about why she pursued post-secondary education. She saw education, university education, as empowering. And that was her word, empowering. And education was a way to fight oppression and give back to her community. But while higher education does not necessarily directly lead to obtaining better employment as she perceives and other opportunities, she hopes that her university education will be helpful to her. A Salvadorian parent, a working class Latino youth who was born in Toronto. She was raised by her mother with her two older sisters. And her life then was always to avoid the kinds of oppressive situation, the belittling that she experienced in school, and the inferiority that people tend to impose on her. And it's through education she saw that was coming. Now, it is true that education serves a very important function, and it is true that Tristiana looking to education was useful, because according to Statistics Canada, due to the increase in high-skilled occupation during this decade, 2019 to 2028, 2/3 of all new jobs are expected to require a post-secondary education. But only about 50% of eligible Canadians have universal access to some form of post-secondary education. And insofar as not everyone has equitable access to post-secondary education, which is recognized as one of the most influential and instrumental tools available in society, it is important for young people to have these opportunities so that they're able to maximize their talent and potential and achieve the kinds of lives that they would eventually want to live in the society. And yeah, many of these parents might, especially marginalized, racialized, and immigrant parents, do encourage their children to attend university, believing that the importance of education and post-secondary education in particular. Many children tend not to act on this belief for any number of reasons, and hence miss out on further education. However, a recent study that we did in which we engaged most students, most of them first generation, and came from marginalized communities. Almost all of them were interested in obtaining post-secondary education, all of whom we talked to once they were going through high school. In fact, the OECD data indicates that in recent decades, first generation students are increasingly entering today's universities and community colleges, with about 22% of young adults in OECD countries attaining post-secondary education, even though their parents had not obtained post-secondary education. And this was data that was gathered in 2019, 2018. So I would assume that increase more of the students in universities today would be first generation, and that's increasing, and we need to pay attention to it. In the Canadian context, uh, the Statistics Canada writes that the children of immigrants are generally more likely than their counterparts from third or higher generation to complete post-secondary education. And these are children of immigrants between the ages of 23 and 27 years old. They earned university degrees and compete with their counterparts from third generation, so 43% of immigrants versus 29% of third plus generation or higher achieving post education. And while it is true that many of these children likely had immigrant peers with some post-education, since most of them might be new to the Canadian context, we have to think that the parents' post-secondary education would not have been in Canada or in the countries to which they have immigrated, and therefore the relationship with post-secondary education would be as first generation, even though their parents might have had some, as I said. Wingate of the United States writes, many immigrant parents may have college education from their country of origin, but not the college knowledge of the United States. Therefore, their children may experience many of the same first in university as traditional first generation students. Moreover, studies indicate that first generation post-secondary education students are often immigrants, racialized youth who come from low socioeconomic background. They're also often parents, employees, and caretakers of their extended families and communities. They do not all have the same or common story, yet aspects of their narratives echo and weave together to form a pattern reflecting both the richness they bring to the campuses and the obstacles they encounter in academia. So we are talking today about the experiences of first generation students in post-secondary education. And what I want to also do now is also talking about the context in which today's context. Yes, I talked with and worked with people some 20 years ago. Now, what's today's context that we must pay attention to as we pay attention to these students who are coming in? And we have to pay attention to their identities, their background, and for all these things matter and affect how they're able to eventually succeed in the Canadian society. So I want to identify a number of factors that I think might be operating. First of all, COVID-19, which has disrupted the lives of all Canadians and exacerbated the health, education, and other inequities in the society. And since 2020, we have had the George Floyd killing in the US that has sparked a number of responses in terms of EDI and so forth, not only in the US, but in the Canadian society and world over. We have had also actions following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which was released in 2015. And that has documented the history and long-term impact of residential school system on Indigenous students and their families. It provided residential school survivors an opportunity to share their experience, and we're now able to use some of these experiences when we are encountering Indigenous people in universities. And therefore, we're going to have to pay attention to those long-term experiences that they bring. Our context as well have, and we're hearing lots of attack on critical race theory by not, and this is not only happening in the US, but also in our Canadian education system, where they're claiming this theory is divisive and it pits racialized groups against white people. And therefore, we need to not talk about these critical race theory stuff. And the same thing is happening with EDI, with equity, diversity, and inclusion, or decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion, in that the claim is that EDI is undermining what it means to support the notion of equity, democracy, and meritocracy. And we're hearing about EDI as probably we are not doing well enough to bring some of the strongest students or the strongest scholars onto campuses because we're doing these issues and undermining what might be seen as the best way and the most qualified people that we should hire. And yesterday, I listened a webinar that I could send to all of you that called into question the efficacy of critical race theory, and asking, and the professor, he's a professor in Ontario, he says, where's the research evidence that claims that theorists claim that race is a factor in people's experiences? He talked of EDI, critical race theory, as coming about by former Marxists, he called them. And he said, so rather than using class these days, what's being substituted now is race. And the claim is that it is how students apply themselves to their learning that is responsible for their achievement, and not necessarily race operated or class having operated. And he talked about referencing statistics Canada that shows racialized students who are most successful in accessing post-secondary education and doing very well. So how can we claim race is a factor? So this is the context in which we are having this discussion. And this is the context in which we are going to be talking about and welcoming racialized students and other marginalized students onto our university campuses. So therefore, what I'm saying then should not be just simply to look at what's happening with the students, but to understand the larger context, the institutional context, because these are the institutions that are bringing and doing away with EDI, might be telling us not to do some of these critical theories, et cetera, and in the larger society. And of course, we cannot leave the media out of engaging in this discussion. So we have to not ignore then the colonial history of the Canadian context and the settler colonialism that we have inherited. That's one. We cannot also ignore the categorical inequity and social reproduction theories that draw attention to the ways in which the inescapable settler colonialism and the ideology of neocolonialism drive the policies and practices of educational institutions, and in turn, shape the social and educational experiences, participation, aspirations, and outcomes of individuals. So therefore, this is the context we must constantly pay attention to. Researchers have long highlighted the ways in which schools reinscribe the racial meanings that shape students' understanding of what is academically and socially possible for them in the society where some students enjoy social privileges and others, like marginalized students, don't enjoy such privilege. The fact is, teachers, appraisals, just as professors' appraisals, instructional groupings, and early schooling in elementary and secondary school set students on an educational path that leads them into particular post-high school activities, such as employment, opportunities to attend college or university. Understanding that the early educational context initiates the path towards educational and life outcome means that each educational institution must pay attention to students they are invited into their midst and their role as institution in contributing to the systemic inequities to which students are subjected. And insofar schools are not institutions of equal opportunity, but mechanisms of perpetuating social inequality, as Colin writes, with reference to reproduction theory, it is imperative that consideration is given to the social, political, economic, and cultural context in which we are operating, noting how changes over time and the agency that individuals exercise in the attempt to gain the education that we promote and we think that they should all have. Indeed, individuals, and we are here talking of students, do actively engage in making sense of their social world and the conditions within society and the social structures of the institution in which they operate. And therefore, we need to see how they make sense of that world, and we need to take into account the agency that they try to exercise in making those sense. Therefore, inadequate academic support is what we need to also pay attention to. Studies have long shown that students' achievement are based on race, class, ethnicity, sexual identification, religion, area of residence, and so forth. So we just can't say that's just a student. We need to understand how all these different characteristics or factors are contributing to their social lives and their educational situation, and the gaps that they bring into our institution. And therefore, the institution, as institutions, we need to pay attention to how we widen this gap or try to narrow this gap. When I think of university students, and one of the things that drew me to start thinking of paying attention to the experiences of students in universities, because I've spent a lot of time talking about students going through high school, getting to university. But in my work with university students, and this goes back a long time, I've paid attention to how they talk about how they negotiate in universities. They talk about having to prove themselves to their professors and their peers. And that is, they used to do that in high school. Now they're doing that in universities, have to prove themselves. And for marginalized and racialized students coming from high school with their experience and knowing this societal construct and stereotypes that they have of them, especially students like Black students or even Indigenous students and others, they know that those could operate to limit them once they get into university. So they're constantly having to prove themselves. So you can understand that to prove themselves, they have to work harder, and they have to, and some would tell me that they have to work twice as hard as their peers, because only in doing so they will be able to make it through university. You can understand the pressures, psychological and social and other pressures, that trying to do these things would engender in the lives of these students. And I keep wondering, do we pay attention to that once they're in university? I think about how we might pay attention to that. Sometimes I think about students asking for an extension for an assignment. And do we say no because other students are given the assignment on time? Or do we as I always wonder about some student giving Black students assignment, asking them to rewrite and things like that before giving them, knowing that the different conditions under which they live? Or are we saying that we have to give students the same treatment if we're going to give them equal treatment? Therefore, we need to come to terms between the whole idea of equity and equality, and pay attention to how these are going to play out in the lives of these students. Because working harder or working twice as hard, having to prove themselves that they're intellectually just as good and even better than some of their peers, also the narratives that we need to pay attention to and see how these students might feel differently if we pay attention to these conditions that they deal with. I keep thinking about when I interview these students, I hear them say they're working twice as hard or harder and having to prove themselves. And in some cases, some of them say they police themselves or they police their languages. I keep remembering that when I interviewed students in some work I did in 1990, those were the exact same language that racialized students were using. And this is 2020, in 2020. And, you know, if you're still hearing the same thing, you keep wondering, what's happening in the university? What have we done over all these years in terms of changing the conditions of these students? And of course, what they're saying to us is that they're having to deal with the stereotypes that they encounter. And of course, is dealing with this stereotype. I keep remembering Harrison and Steele's work to talk about the stereotype threat. So this stereotype threat is one of the things that working against. Stereotype threat is a situational predicament in which people are or feel themselves at risk of confirming the stereotype, and they don't want to confirm the stereotype because if they confirm the stereotype, that means that they are implicated in that, or they always think that they cannot confirm the stereotype because I have to remember that my sibling or other people from my community might be in jeopardy because of the stereotype. So this idea of living with that community in mind is one of the things that racialized students, marginalized students are constantly bringing into their work in the university when we're dealing with them. And it's a contributing factor to long-term racial and gender differences that we see with the students with whom we work. So what's to be done? How might we as education reimagine education differently and within an equity framework in order to provide students and an education that is relevant and responsive to their particular experiences and ambitions of today? So here, I'll bring us back then and return to the work that we did in terms of the first generation. And I said the first generation is not meant to align with hierarchical discourse of difference when I use first generation. It does not imply differences based on a deficit, concept, or subject that they are lacking in skills, abilities, and competences of the privileged middle class and upper class students that we traditionally see in universities and to whom universities and colleges cater. Of course, it would be interesting to look at the registrar. And, you know, I always wonder sometimes, do universities pay attention to the schools from which students apply in order to bring, and does an 80 in one school mean the same thing as 80 from some other school, all those percentages. So it's not just what I'm working with and when I encounter students in university, in the classes, we have to constantly think about that whole process of moving through high school into university and how university places them. We believe that in many ways, post-secondary education, post-secondary institution classification of first generation sometimes conflict with students' interest. You know, I keep thinking when I think of first generation students and these things, I know this is not very common in the Canadian context, but I think in the American context where students get access to some of those universities and named universities because they had a parent who went to that university. And, you know, and sometimes, I don't know how much this has changed, but sometimes even in applying to some of these universities, there would be some question about your parents' affiliation with that university. And so we have to start thinking about how universities we have to work with universities to challenge the reproduction of the systemic nature of discrimination that the students that want to enter universities need. So institutions often fail to work in the interest of first generation, and in doing so frequently fail to take the interest of first generation students into account. Examples include viewing growth in student numbers in terms of increased revenue. So the point here then is universities like and there are in some cases government funding sometimes for first generation students, and universities will just simply use that to get first generation students onto campuses, and in us treating students as consumers, seeking to diversify our university population, and then putting these racialized bodies on the websites of the universities to attract students, but not only local students, but international students, where these international students are going to come to bring more funding, more money into the universities, are some of the ways in which these things are happening and how universities might be exploiting for these first generations, especially when, as I indicated earlier, many of these first generation students are racialized and new immigrants to the country. And sometimes university first generation students are seen as a security for government funding, and continuing to measure success through a meritocratic achievement model that prioritizes employability, wealth, and productivity of how the students might produce once they get in. So the work that we did with first generation and the students with whom we work, and the students that we invited to the university, we paid attention to where they were coming from, and we paid attention to the difficulties that they had, they were bringing with them, and we paid attention to their coming in unfamiliar with the higher education model that we were engaged in at the university. We also paid attention to the first generation students who were bringing a wealth of lived experiences and knowledge to university, where, as Jagar said, they enter a world that is often alien to them, both in terms of context and in expectations. Scholars have reasoned that community is an important resource in the schooling and educational lives of students, and for marginalized students and racialized students, for whom the Eurocentric and middle-class school context functions to alienate them, community provides a nourishing support. He also writes that students acquire community cultural wealth, which they bring as a necessary resource and asset into their schooling, and they use this in order to navigate and negotiate the education system. And too often, we as educators do not recognize or acknowledge that wealth that students bring from the community. And even the students themselves do not recognize that wealth that they bring to their university. It was about a month ago, I was talking with an East African fellow who he had switched universities, and he was now at another university. And he was saying that he was talking about the classes he was in, and these classes were filled with middle class kids who knew the system quite well. And he was lamenting how they're more likely to do better than him. So I had to say to him, no, but you come with some special social wealth. The fact that you were driven by the fact that you wanted to prove that you can get into university, that in itself is a social capital that you must capitalize on. And as some of the students I talked to like 2 weeks ago, one said, listen, I have no choice. My parents expect me to be successful. And again, 2 students I'm working with, are determined to graduate in for June convocation, because they do not want the convocation to be in the fall, because they want the family to be present. So these are indicators of some of the issues that first generation students are constantly lamenting or dealing with as they negotiate themselves in university. I use the term community referenced approach, which I think as that community reference approach I constructed as way of paying attention to the selves that students bring into their educational pursuit, and how the community in which they live help to identify them and help them to construct a self that they determine will be successful once they get in. I liked New York Times article by Anthony Jack, and he wrote in his essay, "I was a low-income college student, and classes weren't the hard part," he says. Neighborhoods are more than a collective of homes, he writes. Neighborhoods are more than a collection of homes and shops, more than uneven sidewalks or winding roads. Some communities protect us from hurt, harm, and danger. Others provide no respite at all. This process is not random, but the consequence of historical patterns of exclusion and racism. Life is in privileged communities means that children traverse safer streets, have access to good schools, and interact with neighbors who can supply them the proverbial cup of sugar. Life is in distressed communities can mean learning to distinguish between firecrackers and gunshots. The point is, students coming to school and coming to in our midst, coming from communities, are negotiating a lot more than just simply what we see, and therefore we have to think of how that's operating in their lives. And as Hill Collins asserts, community is more than a cognitive construct or a random collection of individuals, for it is infused with emotions and value-laden meanings, which can move people to action by simulating feelings of connection. Being responsive to students' dynamic relationships with their communities also entails acknowledging the settler colonial context from which they've come, and therefore paying attention to how we are going to address that. So as a major socializing institution in which we engage, and we have to see how much we eventually sometimes become complicit with the goals and expectations of the universities we are, then we have to start looking at how we generate and how sometimes we mirror inequities in the work that we do. Domina and company writes, even if schools perfectly compensates for racial, ethnic, gender, or class inequities among their students, they would still structure and legitimate social inequalities in schooled communities. One way in which schools structure inequality is by issuing a differentiated set of educational credentials that interact with labor markets and other social systems to influence individuals' placement in contemporary system of social stratification. And I think of this categorical inequities right now because I'm teaching a cohort of Indigenous students. And of course, as a person well-schooled in the expectations of university, I went in with my course outline with everything, what the readings, and everything that I would think should be on the course outline. And one student said that they expected to come to a decolonized class, but the colonial way in which I structured the class was not really welcoming of their experiences. And that's something that resonate all the time that we need to say. So how much are we able to move away from the program policies and practices in which we're schooled to really accommodate the kinds of differences that these students bring to university. I think you have Peter, and I'm going to hurry up and finish soon so that we can have some conversation. I think of Peter, a bridging program participant who's always expected to attend university by his mother. And his mother had immigrated to Canada years earlier from a small Caribbean island in search of employment, educational career opportunities, but not for herself, but also, and even more important, as she would say to Peter, for her future children. Remember, her children were all born here. She did not have any children when she came, but she came here thinking that once she had children, that the society would be the society for them. She believed strongly that post-secondary education would afford Peter the opportunities that had ultimately eluded her. So, socialized by his mother on the benefits and value of education, he affirmed in his initial interview with us, Leanne Taylor and I, he said, "I am also a firm believer that many of the world's problems can be combated through education and knowledge." And in his application, Peter, who came into the program, wrote, "I'm very honored to be considered by this innovative project. This is special to me because I feel there are several awards, scholarship, and prizes out there that recognize academic excellence, athletic ability, or leadership, but few that take into account the barriers many are forced to overcome on the road to achieving their goals." So successfully dealing with adversity is one of the most important characteristics in succeeding in life. Life is a poker game, he said. Some people are dealt flushes while others are lucky to leave the table with their shirts on their back. I consider myself a person who makes the best of the cards I'm dealt under these circumstances. And so what's interesting as I go on is notice the metaphors that these students use to capture what they're saying to us about their experiences in university. In a follow-up interview with Peter years later, while we were working on this book, he explained that while a university education can be helpful, for some students, distraction can make getting that education a struggle. As he explained, I made a few friends in class, but I had too many things to think about, like the barriers. While many of my peers were thinking about how to get assignments in, I was thinking about how to cover money together for food and rent. Peter went on to say that these institutions and systems do not embrace the people that are excluded from accessing post-secondary education, because even as they are present in their spaces, anti-indigeneity, anti-Black racism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, and transphobia continue to operate to make life difficult for them. He concludes, "It's hard to let your hair down when you don't know if it is safe. So individuals have to look elsewhere to have critical discussions and to make friends." Interestingly, even as Peter questioned what might be gained from university, he simultaneously gave credit to the opportunities he attained while there that set him on his career path. For instance, it was through the program's Future of Work course that he did at university that he learned about inequity, and he advocated for social justice, and at the same time did eventually landed his job that he is into. Interestingly enough, we connected with Peter because Peter dropped out. He did not complete the program. But we connected with Peter while we're doing this follow-up. And how we've connected with him is because he was running for federal as a federal candidate in the elections. And so we found out. So what he did now, he left university. He told us that he got enough, as he said, he got enough, and he was willing to go out in the world, and he was doing lots of advocacy work for people who are unhoused. So Peter illustrates a common understanding that university is key to social mobility, but it's not always the ones that through which people might realize their opportunities and realize their gifts. To understand how university might support first generation students like Peter and the pursuit, we must learn about, comprehend, and appreciate their lived experiences and the complexities of their lives as shaped by the underlying structural forces that regulate their needs and interests and hope. This involves thinking about these students' situation and their challenges and working to them. Stories like Peter's signal that students from various marginalized backgrounds are seeking out higher education in ever larger numbers. But while some might get into university and succeed, that success is not guaranteed. And in some cases, it can come at a high cost beyond the financial commitment that they have. Therefore, if institutions are to understand and address accessibility and participation, they must also take into account all these things that the students are signaling to us. In her essay, Swimmer, Nicole Dennis Ben wrote of her experiences as an immigrant and first-generation post-secondary student growing up in New York, and she's from Jamaica. She recalled that her father dropped her off at the university, and she writes, the only thing he left me with were his words: know your place, keep quiet, work hard. She went on to say, as the first in my immediate family to go to university, I already knew or had given myself some reason to believe that I was no longer my father's problem. I looked around, almost bewildered that I was by myself, for away from my father's apartment in Hempstead, New York, and definitely far away from home in Jamaica with my siblings, my mother and my grandmother. I must have been terrified because I remember standing there outside the dorm building for a very long time. I had $100 in my pocket, a suitcase, ambition, and no clue. And I think that's important. Dennis Ben, an aspiring doctor, entered university after attending community college, and she explained that as the eldest in her family and the first to pursue post-secondary education, she was assumed to be the smart one and the responsible one. She represented hope for her family. And she said, I learned very early that to be an immigrant in this country meant I don't have the luxury of choosing what I wanted, only what was necessary. She uses the metaphor of swimming through the various ocean tides to regulate how she learned to navigate new and different spaces and places, saying, she writes, I learned long ago never to swim against a red current, but to float, to conserve energy, to remain as calm as possible, drifting on the high seas of uncertainty. Through her struggles, she also learned that the measure of my success is not the American dream, but my ability to swim out of the current, parallel to shore, and trust that the waves would carry me. And so she talks about her swimming, and I like the metaphor of swimming, but there's also another metaphor that I want us to pay attention to. And I think of this all the while, is where, notice she says her father dropped her to the university and he bid her. And too often, many of these first generations are coming to universities with their parents have dropped them off, or the community have been dropped them off. But by that I mean, they're prepared, they say go to university, and they once they enter university, we think we have done the job as a community and as parents, and they go in without having that pipeline or network of people to enable them once they get to university, to support them, to make them understand the university structure. And we think that we have done our job while we drop them off and they go in. And university, on the other hand, doesn't have an infrastructure to support them and help them negotiate those structures. And we as professors, we go in, we think of all the students are the same, and we lecture them and then we leave. And so that's what I always think of. What about that students who don't have those other opportunities, who do not know how to make themselves known the very first day they come into class to the professor, so that the professor would pay attention to them and think that they have important contributions to make. So I get back to Dennis Ben when she talked about becoming a first generation postsecondary student. And she says it often represents several things. Like, for them, it's confirmation that they're smart and possessing the intellectual ability and skills to do academic work. It represents breaking or talking back to stereotypes of them and their ethno-racial groups. It represents a path towards realizing their dreams, aspirations, hopes, and of those of their families. And those of the families are a constant factor here. And it's also the means by which they might escape the racialized circumstances of poverty in particular. And for them, it's also a way of giving back to their community. I'm going to end here and have us use the rest. Of course, I have much more to say, but I'll end here and use the rest of the time in conversation. But one of the things I would also add before is what we have discovered when we do use it. It's those students in the class that we know as first generation that we're working with. But there's one student we worked with and who's now living in Alberta, who dropped out of university, and he had a child while he was in this program, and he did not finish. But he's determined to have his son complete university, and he has done everything to do so. And so he has gotten in touch with myself and Leanne Taylor, asking us to talk to his son, working with his son in order so that his son can realize the opportunities that he did not realize. So first generation does not necessarily mean that they might complete, but it might mean that what they get in university set them up for, if I did not do it, my child will. And so we must also see it as, for us, it's like a generation later, we're still doing the work of facilitating life through university. Thank you. And I'm looking